most important document at Vatican I wasn't the document on the papacy. The document on the papacy, of course, that was awesome. That was great. It was actually a document which is specifically written about issues of apologetics. Now, many of you may know of De Filius, but you're probably not aware that this is about apologetics. And I think what it reveals is it actually reveals a prominent sickness about the ways in which people normally think about apologetics. When we're thinking about apologetics, we're thinking about issues like faith, divine revelation, motives of credibility. How many of you out there, especially those of you who are very frequently arguing with other people about matters of religion, your goal is to make that person a Catholic? So you are doing, by definition, apologetics. Could you define to me what faith is? Could you define to me what divine revelation is? Could you define to me what motives of credibility are? What are the different motives of credibility? How is the assent of faith brought about in relation to the motives of credibility? These are questions that only a very small portion of Catholics actually know. Yet, a lot of you are very zealous in defending the faith. A lot of you are very excited to defend the faith. But you have to know these very fundamental truths. You have to understand even what we're doing in the first place. And unfortunately, most people have boiled down apologetics and boiled down the task of the apologist, boiled down even what faith is, simply to you agree with a number of different arguments that get brought forward. That's what it is for a lot of people. And really, this is, I think, for a lot of us, especially those of us who are supposed to be out here, making videos, writing articles, doing stuff like this. I think that's actually also a condemnation of a lot of us. I think for most of us, we are very quick, and this is for myself as well. We're very quick to go out there and to knock you over the head for what you guys don't know. We like to go out there and talk about, you don't know this thing, you don't know that thing. And these things are very important things to know, but you should know it, right? So a lot of us will bring that up, but I think the bigger question is, why aren't we talking about it? Right? Because you guys really reflect in a way, in a way you reflect as in a mirror what we are, what a lot of us online content creators are, what a lot of us talk about is what you guys talk about. What a lot of you guys, the arguments you guys bring are the arguments we bring. So I think we have to actually have an even deeper conversation, right? Why are we out there only talking about this set of topics? Why are we only talking about, niche questions on the papacy, let's say, or niche questions on the filioque, or whatever other topic that we think will get people to listen? That's a very good question. Because if I was out here and if all of the other guys were out here talking about every day what faith is, what the motives of credibility are, and, all of those other questions, if I was bringing up, the theological virtues all the time, although I think amongst most content creators, I probably bring up the theological virtues the most. But beside that point, if we were bringing these up all the time, if this is what all of the content creators online were talking about all the time, this is what you guys would be talking about, right? So we do have to ask ourselves these questions. What are we talking about? Why are we talking about it? Are we talking about the more important things more times, the more fundamental things more times? We can talk about the detailed stuff. We can talk about the more niche stuff as well. That stuff is all fun. It's all fine, but we need to have a little bit of proportionality. And for you guys as well, you guys need to have a little bit of proportionality. And one of the most important things, as I mentioned, has to do with these central questions of divine revelation. What is divine revelation? If, I brought you up here and put you in front of everybody, would you be able to answer that very clearly and concisely? Would you even have a concept of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about divine revelation and how it's distinct from natural revelation or scientific knowledge or any of these other concepts that we bring forward? What is faith? I think that's one of the most important questions that you need to answer. What is faith? How is faith distinct from opinion? How does certainty play into faith? What is scientific knowledge and what is scientific certainty? What is moral certainty, right? All of these different questions and related topics to faith are very important because, especially in a contemporary American environment, or for those of you outside of America, it's probably very similar for you as well. What do we mean when we use the word faith? When we call somebody a man of faith, what does that mean? Faith usually there is taken for anti-Catholic notions. There are certain notions that Protestants took traditionally of faith, at least the majority of them, that is repugnant to the way in which Catholics use the term. There are certain views amongst modern Protestants and those influenced by modern Protestants. And by modern, I mean, like late 19th century modern. But there's the modern Protestants, there's the modernist notion of faith. There's all of these different other notions of faith that actually come into play when we're thinking about the term. So when you look at your intuitive grasp of what is meant by the term faith, you can't trust that. You're probably influenced by many different heterodox views of what faith even means. And really, when you read something like Pascendi from St. Pius X, when you read even De Filius from Vatican I, when you read all of those central theologians who wrote against the modernists, what you will see is they will say the very key and foundation of modern errors comes down to misunderstanding what faith is, misunderstanding what divine revelation is, misunderstanding what nature is and what the supernatural order is. These different issues in particular are actually not simply, nerdy theological niche questions, right? These are foundational for understanding where the modern world went wrong. So you have to ask yourself, do you know the answer to these questions? Because you need to. If you're going to all participate in Catholic action in any way, if you're going to talk to people about the Catholic faith, you need to know these things, right? Because when you're talking to somebody about the Catholic faith, what do you want them to do? You want them to believe Catholicism, right? You want them to be a Catholic. So how does it play into your ability to even communicate with that person if you don't even know what faith is? What methods you're going to use, right? Because your method should be proportioned to your end, and your end is that person to have faith. So if you don't even know the end, how are your means going to look like? Do you think that if you're just going to walk up to somebody and kind of, chit chat and say, wow, look, this is really cool, Catholicism's really awesome, you think that's the sort of most efficacious method? Perhaps, but perhaps not. You wouldn't be able to know because you don't know what faith is, right? You don't know how the movement of the Spirit relates to faith, how the judgment of credibility, because you don't know what the motives of credibility are, relate to the assent of faith, right? You don't know how divine revelation relates to it, because faith, in a way, is acceptance of divine revelation. So if you don't know what divine revelation is, you don't know what the mysteries of the faith are, you don't know what a dogma is, you don't know all of these things, you don't know the role of the church in proposing all of this, how are you most efficaciously even going to do something as simple as talk to somebody about the faith, to witness to the faith to somebody? These are all very good questions. And I think that Vatican I, in its full exposition of this question, at the sort of utmost levels of authority, gives us very, very, very clear answers to all of these questions. And it explains it in a systematic way. It gives all of the details that you need. And it gives the details in a way that is not really up for debate, up for difference of opinion. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to give a brief synopsis to the answers to a lot of these questions, how all of these concepts relate to one another. And then I actually want to get into the text of Vatican I itself, and I want to explain to you what all of these different terms mean, how they relate to one another, and how this affects practically the different modern errors that often come up, especially amongst Catholics. Okay, so first, what you need to understand in order to get the sort of synthesis, to get the summary, is you need to understand what divine revelation is. Because remember, faith is the acceptance of divine revelation. And the motives of credibility are rendering credible divine revelation. And the judgment of credibility is the judgment that divine revelation is credible from those motives, right? So all of these things are going to surround your notion of divine revelation. Now, divine revelation is basically God's teaching of mankind. You look throughout the Gospels and you see something. You see that actually Jesus Christ very frequently says that he came to reveal the Father to us. He came to reveal the will of the Father to us. And what do you see when you see Christ sending out the apostles? Well, Christ sends out the apostles to preach what he said to the nations, right? It's supposed to bring his message to the nations. So, what divine revelation is divine revelation is ultimately the supernatural message of God to mankind. And this is extremely important. When you actually look at traditional Catholic theology and how they will, or contemporary as well, you look at traditional Catholic theology and how they're even envisioning like what the magisterium is, who the magisterium teaches divine revelation to us. Why does the magisterium need to have infallibility? Why does a magisterium need to be a rule of faith? You think about all these different things. It's really going to be proportioned to that divine revelation right there. Why is it the case on all of these different things? Well, it's because divine revelation is of such a character. The purpose of divine revelation is to convert all men, not only the smartest men, but also the normal and the simple man. It's for all men to have a firm and grasped certitude of divine revelation. So this is very important right there. That's kind of the nucleus or the foundation, is to remember divine revelation is basically the teaching of God to mankind. And specifically, this divine revelation is something which is public. It's something which is destined for all of mankind to accept, to submit themselves to, and to obey. So, what is faith now? Well, faith, I said, was the belief in divine revelation. Well, how does that differ from other types of faith? Because you've never seen scientific evidence for your birth, right? You've never seen, the clocks on your birthday. You never saw the calendar on your birthday, right? You were obviously, not able to cognize those things because of the weakness of your faculties. But your parents tell you your birthday and you believe your parents. So your parents say you were born on this day, June 1st, let's say. You were born on June 1st, 2001. And your parents, they seem like reliable and trusted guides. So you actually believe what they say. You accept what they say on the basis of their authority. So I mentioned scientific knowledge before. Like, I don't, let's say you're thinking about the knowledge that you have of, certain principles of metaphysics, let's say, or certain principles of logic, let's say. On the basis of those things, you actually have an intrinsic evidence to it. You have evidence where you can draw a syllogism and draw forth the conclusion, right? You have, or maybe you have sense evidence of something. I see this hat right here on my desk. That's a pretty awesome hat, actually. I like it. Crown of Thorns hat. But you have your hat on your desk. You look at the hat. You have immediate sensory evidence of this. But when it comes to your birth, I mentioned, you weren't there. You didn't see it. You didn't see the calendar. You didn't experience it in a way that you could cognize it and hold it in your memory, right? So you don't have that intrinsic or immediate evidence. Rather, you have faith in this thing. You believe on the account of somebody's authority. You believe on the account of your parents' authority, right? And why are your parents credible? Well, your parents are credible because you have experienced, over time, the fact that they would not lie to you. If somebody randomly came up to you on the street, you were just sitting there and said, your parents died, that would be one thing. You might not believe them, actually, because that person is not really credible to you, right? But if, your sister called you on the phone and said your parents died, that person's a very credible person to you. So even while you haven't experienced this, where either by your senses or by some other means, you haven't experienced this knowledge, you have somebody testifying to this knowledge. So when it comes to faith, we also label faith, shorthand's faith, we label it as divine faith. What does divine faith mean? Well, what divine faith means is that it is faith in God. So it's not your parents, it's not your sister, it's not your neighbor. It's not all of these people who you may have some trust in. It's rather God, who can neither deceive nor be deceived. God can neither deceive nor be deceived. So therefore, what he says, we are believing, because we don't have this direct and intuitive vision of a lot of what he says. This is why Christ didn't have faith, for example. Christ says that he actually came to preach to us what he himself saw. Christ had the beatific vision throughout his entire time on earth. So he actually was bringing what he saw. Christ did not have divinely revealed to him in the way in which we have it. He did not accept these things on faith. Rather, he saw what he preached to us. So with us, we believe these things because God has told us this. So we have faith, and rather than it being human faith, it's divine faith. But there's a difficulty here, and I'm sure all of you can kind of comprehend what this difficulty is immediately. So we have divine revelation, God's teaching us. We have faith, which is the response that we believe what God says. But there's kind of an issue here with authentication, right? Because we could have, just like in the former case that I brought up, you could have your sister call you, or you could have a random person on the street. There's differing degrees of credibility that goes in there. Well, there's something similar that happens for religion, right? We had Muhammad come and say that he was bringing the true will of God to men. And then you had a bunch of people, they said, I trust the plan, so I'm just going to believe what goes on. I mean, you read, for example, Dominus Jesus. Dominus Jesus, it talks about this. It says that only Christianity, only Catholicism in particular, but only Christianity can have theological faith, because theological faith is something which responds to divine revelation. Whereas others, they only have a certain sort of belief because they have somebody who's coming, they're mixing together truth and falsehood. They're mixing together all of these different things. And ultimately, they are coming on false pretenses. They're saying they're from God. They're not really from God. So there's a certain sort of belief that people have in what he says, but this is not theological faith because it is not on the basis of God revealing and authenticating what he says. So we have Muhammad over here. We have all of Joseph Smith over here. We have all of these false prophets, people coming from God and saying, hey, not coming from God, people coming and saying that they are from God, rather. They come to us and they say, hey, I'm preaching the true will of God. Believe what I say. Because what's very important, and we can distinguish here between what's called immediate revelation. Because there are certain cases where God directly speaks to somebody and provides the evidence for the fact that he is speaking himself, right? He's saying, I'm God, listen to me. And, you have experienced this. And therefore, since you have experienced this, you believe on a sort of direct basis. But that's not the way in which God normally acts towards mankind, right? God doesn't normally come down from the cloud, so to speak, like he did on Mount Sinai. He doesn't, at least to us, come in the flesh like he did in the incarnation. Rather, what he does is he speaks through appointed messengers. He speaks through the apostles. He speaks through those preachers which come. Remember from Romans 11, how are we supposed to believe unless there's a preacher? And how is there supposed to be a preacher unless he is sent? So we have all of these different preachers sent to us. We have the Catholic Church, which comes to us and says, hey, we are divine legate. We are passing on the revelation from Christ through the apostles. This has been handed down to us through all ages. We have all of these different conflicting reports of people saying that they're from God. So how are we supposed to distinguish this, right? How are we supposed to distinguish truth from error, from a genuine revelation to a false revelation? Because we all know, we're all kind of coming to the table with the acknowledgement that if God says something, we need to believe it. So how do we know where God has spoken? And this question is really the question of what is called the motives of credibility. The motives of credibility. Because And this is what we need to be extremely, we need to just thread the needle ever so precisely. Because on the one hand, you can fall into the precipice of a sort of pseudo supernaturalism, thinking that God is going to somehow never use any sort of medium between us and divine revelation, that he is just going to immediately illuminate us, and we're going to, without any sort of means before us, we're going to have faith without any sort of objective means, only in the purely subjective realm. Or on the other hand, you're going to have people who are going to become rationalists, and they're going to become naturalists, and they're going to say that actually there is some sort of medium through divine revelation, but it's within us. The rationalists, they're going to say it's through the medium of I'm able to actually reason out all of the propositions from natural reason of the Catholic faith, and I'm going to have intrinsic evidence for all of it. So from this, it would be very easy to judge who has spoken. We would just use some syllogism and we'd be good. Other people, the modernists, what the modernists are going to say is they're going to say not through the medium of reason are we able to judge this, but it's actually through the medium of our sensible feelings. They call it the religious sense. They say that we just have such an intense internal experience with God. We have such a feeling of our necessary dependence on God that actually we just have this just overflowing of this religious sense and this religious experience. And really, that's actually what in our interactions, this is actually what a collective religious experience is, kind of what divine revelation is for them. Something which is purely subjective. So the rationalists are going to do it through the medium of their intellects. The modernists, they're going to do it through the medium of their feelings. It's kind of gay, actually. It's really, when you read these guys, it's really gay. Modernism leads to homosexuality very clearly. They're all gay, as an aside. But then you have the pseudo-supernaturalists, on the other hand. They say there's no objective medium right here. So Catholicism threads the needle very, very finely. What we say is that there's actually these motives of credibility. These motives of credibility, because it would be, and there's a sin in Catholicism, it's called credulousness. Credulousness means that you're easy to believe things. The credulous man, somebody tells them something, and without any sort of due regard, without any sort of due rationality, they just believe it. And we would be very credulous if we just saw the 10 options, let's say, before our eyes of religions, and we just chose Catholicism, because we really like the way it sounds, or because our parents are Catholics, or because our friends are Catholics. That would be credulous right there. So we have to have some sort of rational basis. The assent of faith cannot be against reason, but also, as I mentioned before, it cannot be somehow mediated by reason, because we don't directly perceive all of the mysteries. We're not able to draw forth conclusions of all the mysteries. So where does this leave us? Well, this leaves us with what are called signs of credibility. So signs of credibility. So think back to that example that I gave when it comes to your sister, your parents, and all of those. Why do you believe them? Well, you believe them because, they have certain attributes that lends them to be credible, them to be believable. So when you say things, it makes sense. In a similar way, when it comes to the message that is preached, it's not like we're going in and we're logically deducing all of the contents of the message believed, but God doesn't need to do that because he preaches through different messengers. So he could give external signs, and these external signs could accredit, what would that word be? He could, authenticate. That's a better word. He could authenticate the fact that these people are actually from him. How does he do that? Well, by doing things that only God could do, right? So God could authenticate the apostles, and it says in sacred scripture, read, for example, the end of Mark, or read the beginning of Acts, or really read throughout all of the Gospels. It's very clear that this is the purpose of the miracles, as an example. So the apostles, they performed miracles in order to authenticate their message. It's not like through the perception of miracles, people were going to logically be able to logically deduce the Trinity or the incarnation like the rationalists would have you believe. But rather, we're able to see this supernatural sign and be able to, from this supernatural sign, know that the messengers are from God. And therefore, on that basis, we would be able to believe what they have to say. We know that this from these signs of credibility, right? From the judgment of credibility, we're able to know that these apostles are credible and what they have to say is credibly from God. And there's a further point here to actually be made about the fact that this doesn't necessarily cause the ascent of faith. It disposes us towards the ascent of faith. But what causes the ascent of faith is that from this, God floods his grace within us, he moves within us, and he brings about within us that ascent of faith, which is always, of course, a gift. Now, when we're looking at these other religions, because we see this for Catholicism, we would say, and we're kind of going to put a pin in it for now. We can come back to this, but we also see when it comes to other religions that they are false religions, and just like we see that there's a motive of credibility on the part of those who preach the truth, right? Those who bring the true and authentic divine revelation, which demands the assent of faith from all of us. There's also those who come and they preach falsehood. Those who come and preach falsehood, it's going to either contradict something of nature, maybe it's they say something that is contrary to what we know by nature. Or maybe they say something that contradicts something that we know by faith, a previous divine revelation. But in either of these cases, this provides what is called a motive of discredibility, a motive of discredibility. Because not only when we have somebody who comes to us as a witness, can we see that they are seen as authenticated, right? They are seen as credible. We also can see, on the other hand, let's say we know that somebody is a habitual liar, or we know somebody that they're a scammer or whatever else. These are motives of discredibility to where we are now liable, if we're being smart, if we're following the dictates of reason, we're actually liable to just not listen to this person because, we know that they are a liar. So when it comes to these two categories, the motives of credibility and the motives of discredibility, this is going to be central when it comes to what apologetics even is about. Because what is apologetics? A lot of people, they don't think about it that much. Well, apologetics, that's the defending of the faith, right? But really, what a lot of theologians labeled apologetics as is de revelatione. What does de revelatione mean? It means on revelation. Because what you do in apologetics is, your goal in apologetics is to bring that person to the place of, you obviously cannot bring them to the place of faith. Faith is something which, as I mentioned, it's a gift of God. It's a supernatural gift. It cannot somehow be elicited by nature. You can pray for that other person that they have faith, and they themselves, they need to pray to have faith, but it's not something that you can elicit. So what is the role of the apologist then? If they can't elicit faith, well, what they can do is they can bring about that judgment of credibility. And I mentioned before, there's both the motives of discredibility and the motives of credibility. The motives of credibility, these are going to be those signs and miracles and all of those other things that render it credible that this person is actually from God. And there's a lot of different categories and distinctions that we could go over when it comes to the motives of credibility. But basically, we need to be impressing that person upon their conscience, right? Because they understand already, if they believe in the existence of God, a personal God who is to be obeyed, if they believe in the existence of God, and they will believe in the existence of an obligation to obey God. And therefore, if they have this obligation to obey God, what are you trying to do? You're trying to particularize that universal right there. They have that universal idea, I need to obey God and listen to him if he has spoken. But we don't really have yet for that person that particular judgment that this is the religion that God has revealed, and therefore I need to obey this particular religion. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to bridge that gap right there. So if you're talking to somebody and they don't already believe in God, they don't already have this universal proposition right there, then you need to bring that about, right? Because if you're talking to somebody who's an atheist, obviously bringing forward motive of credibility after motive of credibility, they don't even believe that there is a God who is speaking and a God who's revealing. So that's kind of a presupposition that needs to be brought about by various different arguments for them. But if you have somebody who already believes in God, what your role is you're trying to bring them to that judgment of credibility. And how is this done? Well, on the one hand, you are trying to impress them with all of those motives of credibilities in ways that they can understand and rhetorically persuasive ways. You are trying to present these motives of credibility, especially those that are most near and dear to them as well. There are certain motives of credibility. If you're telling somebody, about, uh, I don't know, like think of the wildest like early medieval saint legend miracle story ever. If you're telling somebody about that, then that person they're not really well disposed from what you're telling them. That's not really persuasive from what you're telling them, right? So try something that's much more disposed towards that they would be much more disposed towards hearing, right? And then there's also that second portion that I mentioned, the motives of discredibility. So what you have a lot of times is you will have somebody who already has these prejudices against the Catholic faith, against the Catholic religion. This person, like you might go and provide motives of discredibility against Islam to a Muslim, you go up and you talk to them, you say, oh, here are all the reasons why Islam is not true, blah, 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 blah. And maybe you're removing them from that position where they think that Islam is certain, right? That's kind of like a first step right there. Well, equally, this person may have all of these motives of discredibility for Catholicism. Now, we know as Catholics that for all of these, none of them are going to somehow follow, right? They're not going to follow. They're not going to logically proceed because the order of, and this is something the Vatican I is going to go over, the order of nature and the order of grace, the order of natural truth, the order of supernatural truth, these two orders do not contradict, right? So what we do is not only are we providing those motives of credibility to dispose them towards the judgment of credibility, we're also removing impediments. We're answering all of the objections that they may have. And this is really the role of the apologist. What everybody kind of gets to is for most people, out of all of what I had already spoken about, like up to this point, all the points that I've made up to this point, for most people, really what apologetics is kind of boils down to that small sliver of motives of discredibility and then kind of just like positive theology. So you're kind of going over what scripture and the fathers teach. I mean, there's nothing really about the motives of credibility that are authenticating the Catholic Church's divine legate. Like that's not really what it's about, but that's what Vatican I talks about. That's what Vatican I says that we ought to do. So what I want to do now is I actually want to go through the text of Vatican I because it's going to provide a lot of the different distinctions that I just mentioned. And I think it'll provide a good foil for the broad explanation that I just gave to you. So I want to begin in De Filius. I want to begin with chapter 2 because chapter 2 is on Revelation. So this is what it says. The same Holy Mother Church holds and teaches that God, the source and end of all things, can be known with certainty from the consideration of created things, by the natural power of human reason. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. So we're starting here with a postulate of natural theology. That's what a lot of people mention it as. But this really makes a lot of sense. It makes a bunch of sense because what we see is in the apostolic examples and in the examples of the fathers, when they are trying to preach the gospel to other people, when they were trying to preach divine revelation to other people, there's a sort of postulate that begins that we understand that God exists. Sometimes if they're talking to people that are polytheists or have other errors about God, they will correct those. But fundamentally, there's this agreement that God exists and that there's some sort of obligation which flows from God. Like if you're going to even have a discussion about divine revelation, which is whether God has spoken here or spoken there, you're obviously going to have, unless you want to have a simply equivocal discussion, a discussion about nothing, you're going to have this common agreement that God exists. So the first thing that it begins in its treatment of revelation is we can know that God exists from creation by the power of natural reason. And it goes on, It was, however, pleasing to his wisdom and goodness to reveal himself and the eternal laws of his will to the human race by another, that is, a supernatural way. So he's revealed himself in nature. But now God wants to go up and beyond that and to reveal himself in a way that is beyond nature. He's going to be bringing to us those mysteries of the Catholic faith. This is how the apostle puts it. In many places, in various ways, God spoke of old to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by a son. So we know by a natural power of reason that God exists. But God chose to go beyond the created things whereby we could know him. And he chose to reveal himself by the proposition of divine revelation, by, as it says in the text from Hebrews, the speaking to our fathers by the prophets and speaking to us in the last days by his son. So he goes on, it is indeed thanks to this divine revelation that those matters concerning God, which are not of themselves beyond the scope of human reason, can, even in the present state of the human race, be known by everyone without difficulty, with firm certitude, with no intermingling of error. And this is an interesting first thing to bring up. Because when most of us want to think about divine revelation, we're usually thinking about the mysteries of the faith, right? We're thinking about you have the Trinity, you have the incarnation, you have the sacraments, you have grace, you have the virtues, you have the gifts of the Holy Ghost. You know, of all of these things, you have the church, right? You have all of these things which are beyond the capabilities of reason, unaided, without the proclamation of divine revelation, without its accepting by faith, without its intimate perception by the gifts of wisdom and of understanding, right? Without all of that, right? We can't understand those things. But it doesn't actually bring up those things first. It brings up, and let me read it. It brings up those matters concerning God which are not of themselves beyond the scope of human reason. Because we already mentioned that from the beginning. We can know things about God. We can know things about morality. We can know things about politics. We can know things about religion without divine revelation. Like there's a certain natural virtue of religion that comes from the fact that we understand our obligations of justice and that we need to offer to God, all of the obligations that we have. But it doesn't bring up the supernatural aspects. It brings up these natural aspects. And what is the reason for it? It says, so that even in the present state of the human race, these can be known by everyone. So the first qualification, by everyone. Well, the truth of the matter is, with a lot of those natural things that I just brought up, a lot of those things are not obvious to everyone. There's a lot of people who simply think that fornication is fine. They simply think that adultery is fine. They think that, self-abuse is fine. They think that a lot of contraception is fine. They think that a lot of things are fine. So the goal first and foremost is actually to heal those natural powers. It heals those powers of nature which were damaged by original sin and just kind of natively are not that strong in most people, right? So first, we want everyone to know. We don't only want the super smart and wise people to know. We want the least person, 75 IQ person to know that contraception is wrong, to know that, all of these things without having to go through all of the intrinsic moral arguments surrounding it. So this is the first thing it brings up. It's for everyone. Second, without difficulty, because we want these obligations to actually be carried out with firm certitude, which is a very strong impetus to the will to carry these things out. When you're wavering back and forth over whether something is, necessary or not, you're not going to have as strong of an act of the will towards doing that thing, and with no intermingling of error. So those are four things: by everyone, without difficulty, with firm certitude, and without an intermingling of error. So this is what's called the moral necessity of divine revelation. But it goes beyond this. Because we could, in principle, I could know that contraception is wrong from nature. Everybody might not be able to do that. Everybody might not be able to do that with firm certitude. Everyone might not be able to do that without the intermixture of errors. But I could do it. Like I have the intellectual faculties to be able to do something like that. But not only is there this relative or moral necessity that comes with those naturally knowable things, there's also something far beyond that. There's the absolute necessity of divine revelation for those mysteries of the faith. So sanctifying grace, the theological virtues, the gifts of the Holy Ghost, the sacraments, the church, right? The church in her mystery, not in her outward aspects, but in her mystery, the Trinity, the incarnation. These things, they can't be reached by nature. They can't be reached by the powers of my intellect. Like you can see the outward flesh of Christ, but you can't know the incarnation. You can see the outward appearances of the church. You can't know the mystery of the church. You can hear the words of the formula of the Nicene Creed, right? But you can't grasp the innermost, essence of, or the innermost nature of the joining together of subject and predicate that comes into the judgment that the Trinity is true. These things don't happen by nature and by the process of natural reasoning. Rather, they only happen in the supernatural order by the preaching of divine revelation, by the subjective elevation by grace, which flows forth into that virtue of faith, right? So it goes on and it says, it is not because of this that one must hold revelation to be absolutely necessary. So it's not because of our natural needs that it's absolutely necessary. The reason is that God directed human beings to a supernatural end. So beyond that natural end that we had, actually, he elevated us to a further end, the supernatural end. That is a sharing in the good things of God that utterly surpass the understanding of the human mind. Indeed, eye has not seen, neither has ear heard, nor has it come into our hearts to conceive what things God has prepared for those who love him. So now we have the absolute necessity of divine revelation due to our elevation to the supernatural order. And this is what makes so despicable, really, the error of those who are rationalists. They want to judge because I mentioned them earlier, or even the modernists. This is the foundation right here for the error of modernism. This is the foundation of the error of rationalism. And a lot of people fall into it. No, nature does not demand the supernatural order. It's completely incorrect. The nature does not demand the supernatural order. Rather, this was something gratuitous by God of him elevating us to the supernatural order. So, as a consequence of this, reason is not able to adequately demonstrate all of these mysteries. This is why we go so hard against people who try to prove the Trinity from reason. It is not provable by reason. It is a mystery of the Catholic religion. It's a mystery. It's something which transcends natural reason. We're going to go into a little bit later how reason can interact with faith, but this is something which, absolutely speaking, transcends natural reason. So you can't prove this. And actually, if you even think you can prove this, you've already completely misunderstood the very foundations of the Catholic religion. You've misunderstood faith, misunderstood divine revelation. So you've completely evaporated. You've thrown acid on the very foundations of the Catholic religion. This is why this stuff is so dangerous. This is why all of this stuff connects in very closely. And the modernists, on the other hand, a lot of people today are quasi-modernists. How do they think about it? They think that actually when it comes to the interior savoring, the sort of interior feeling or religious sense, that's how it happens, right? That's how it happens. That's how you're able to actually understand and judge when it comes to this matter of religion. You know, a burning in the bosom, if you may, if you kind of want to put it in Mormon terms. But this itself is also something which is abhorrent and abominable in the eyes of the Catholic faith. Why is that the case? Well, it's because your feelings, your sense, comes from the very same foundation as your reason does, right? Human nature. It can only be proportioned to natural ends. So a lot of these things it could dispose towards or maybe remove some obstacles, but it's not going to be able to get you there. That's completely abominable. It's completely, it destroys the foundations of the Catholic religion when you begin to think in this way, which is why we need clear thinking. We need to go from the very principles of the two orders, the very principles of natural revelation versus supernatural revelation. We move on from there, right? This is why we need all of these things. Or you don't even understand why the incarnation happened. You don't even understand why the establishment of the apostolate. Why did Christ send the apostles forward? Why does the Catholic Church continue today and have those necessary gifts of infallibility and indefectibility and visibility and all of these other things? Why are these attributes even in the church? It's perfectly explained once you understand what divine revelation is and the purpose of divine revelation. And you're able to synthesize all of this together. And by the way, if you think this is just like an old Vatican I thing, Catechism of the Catholic Church starts with this. So reread your catechism, okay? Now moving on. That was the first section on Revelation. Here is now the second section, which is called On Faith. Begins. Since human beings are totally dependent on God as their creator and Lord, and created reason is completely subject to uncreated truth, we are obliged to yield to God, the revealer, full submission of intellect and will by faith. Okay. We began here, right? We've already went over God exists, right? And this is what divine revelation is. This is what natural truths are. This is what the moral necessity of divine revelation is. This is what the absolute necessity is. But that is right there just a precept, right? When we think through matters of conscience. With matters of conscience, we have general precepts. And then this is, in a lot of these general precepts or general principles are understood by what's called synderesis. So synderesis is the faculty within us that perceives, let's say, that it is wrong to murder. But then we have this sort of process of practical reason that comes into play. And this is the judgment of conscience. And the judgment of conscience is going to judge, in this case, this is murder. And therefore draw the conclusion that I shouldn't do this. So there's something similar that goes on in the supernatural order, because we have this divine proposition of revelation. And this occurs kind of like that general premise right there in that argument. But we need to ask the question of, is this the case of a divine revelation? So we have generally this idea of an obligation. We already went over this. So it brings up the obligation in the beginning. Since human beings are totally dependent on God as their creator and Lord, the created reason is completely subject to uncreated truth. We're obliged to yield to God, the revealer, full submission of intellect and will by faith. So that obligation objectively exists right there, right? We understand from our very creation, as it mentions here, from our very creation and from the nature of God, we understand that we have obligations to God. So we're now asking the question of, how is this obligation carried out? And we would say that the reaction to divine revelation is faith. That is what it means to carry out the obligations of divine revelation. Just like, the obligations to not commit adultery is, carried out by not committing adultery. In the same way, the obligations which are drawn from the proposition of divine revelation is the assent of faith. Okay? This faith, which is the beginning of human salvation, the Catholic Church professes to be a supernatural virtue. So first, it is a supernatural virtue, okay? It's not like human faith. Divine faith is not like human faith. If you think divine faith is human faith, get that out of your brain, okay? Just eradicate that from yourself immediately. It's extremely dangerous to mix up these two. By means of which, with the grace of God inspiring and assisting us, remember, grace is what comes in before and actually elicits this, which shows us a lot of the role of prayer when it comes to the apologetic encounter and evangelism. It is that by means of which we believe to be true what he has revealed. So what's the matter of what faith attends to? What is revealed? So that's the matter. That is what is believed. What is revealed is what is believed. Not because we perceive its intrinsic truth by the light of natural reason, but because of the authority of God himself. So the matter or the material object of what we believe is, what is revealed. But the formal reason whereby, so that reason why we actually sent to this, it's not because we perceive the intrinsic truth by the natural light of reason. It's not because we have investigated the deposit of divine revelation and somehow come to understand, like the blasphemous naturalists say, the blasphemous rationalists say, we have come to understand intrinsically, everything that is said by the light of reason. It's not because of that. It's rather because of the authority of God himself, who makes the revelation and can neither deceive nor be deceived. Think about this. Think about how awesome that is. Think about how noble that is. Knowledge is more noble insofar as its motive is higher. So, for example, if you have scientific knowledge of something and I only have opinion about it, your knowledge is more noble than mine. It's more noble to know from certain principles than it is kind of to have a guess about it from probabilities. So, what is the most noble of all knowledge going to be? Well, obviously, the beatific vision. But on earth, what is the most noble knowledge that can possibly be? It's the knowledge of faith, because this is to know something on the basis of God's authority, not merely the authority of you, not merely the authority of your brother, right? Not merely the authority of the natural light of reason. It's rather the authority of God Himself revealing. So, think about how blasphemous it is to say for the naturalists to somehow say that faith is basically we can just kind of perceive it by the light of natural reason. We can kind of just see these things by reason. That is dragging faith down from the height of its excellence as a very participation in the knowledge of God. It's dragging that down to the level of how I know that the subway is 10 minutes down the road. It's blasphemy. It's complete blasphemy. And the modernists are just as bad. The modernists are worse. They at least with the rationalists, they think that it is the light of reason which is more noble than any other created bodies, how they know things, right? Any other animals, how they know things. The modernists, they think it's by our passions. They think it's by our senses. We share those with the animals. Are you kidding me? The modernists, they're even worse. They're 10 times worse blasphemers than the rationalists, because at least the rationalists think it's by the light of reason. The modernists think it's about your senses, your sensible passions. It's disgusting. Anyways, nevertheless, in order that the submission of our faith should be in accordance with reason. So this is important. It's an important distinction that makes right here. In order that the submission of our faith should be in accordance with reason. Not that in order that the submission of faith should come by reason. Right? It's not like we're perceiving these things by the light of reason, but rather, as I mentioned earlier, there's a vice called credulousness. Credulousness comes into play when you are quick or easy to believe something. You quickly and easily come to affirm or deny something. It's a lightness of mind that you have. Rather, the submission of faith needs to be something which is reasonable, not unreasonable. So we don't just go up there and when the Catholic Church says, yeah, we preach the truth, they don't just say trust the plan. It's basically the idea. They don't just say like Muhammad did. Okay, I hate to laugh because it's bad. He was a false prophet and he brought a lot of destruction and death and everything. But really, he did just kind of come down and just say trust the plan. I mean, Joseph Smith did the same thing. They just came down. They were like, I'm from God. Trust the plan. And then everyone was just like, oh, yeah, I guess. Yeah, confer St. Thomas, Introduction to Summa Contra Gentiles, where he says only brutish and uneducated men agreed with him. But, Hassan's going to hate me for this. But anyways, it is true. It's like they literally just came down. They were like, yeah, trust the plan. I'm from God. Believe what I have to say. And then everyone was like, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. It's not like they showed miracles or anything. Joseph Smith and Muhammad, they didn't have any miracles. There was no miracles to be had. And when you go into the Eastern religions, it gets even worse. It's like, okay, what are your miracles? And they'll just sit on a bed of nails or something. Like, come on, guy. Come on. You can't just see that and believe it. Is that really where you're at, bud? Like somebody comes and says, I'm from God. I'm preaching the truth. Like, okay, how do I believe you? And they're like, let me cook. And then they sit on a bed of nails. Yeah. Anyways, let's continue. Nevertheless, in order that the submission of our faith should be in accordance with reason, it was God's will that there should be linked to the internal assistance of the Holy Spirit. So we obviously affirm this internal assistance of the Holy Spirit, right? Which we just mentioned in the last paragraph, the illuminating of the light of faith. To join with that, external indications of his revelation. That is to say, divine acts. So how in the world, as I kind of explained earlier, how in the world are we going to have, a revealer who comes and says anything but trust the plan? Obviously we see all of the examples of these pseudo religions and what they bring forward. Clearly these are absurdities, as I mentioned. But when it comes to the true religion, how would God authenticate this as being truly from him? Well, what he would do is he would attach with their message various different things that only he could do. That makes sense? there's various different signs which could only be from God. And these are, according to Vatican I, these are two sorts: prophecies and miracles. The miracles are not necessarily physical miracles, like you raise somebody from the dead or something like that. They're also the moral miracles. So the effects of sanctifying grace, the spread of the gospel, the eminent holiness of the church and of the effects of the church, things like this. Also moral miracles. But it says that very clearly that when it comes to internal experience, things like internal experience, things like a sort of understanding of fittingness with of the Catholic religion with natural things, that these may be used. They may have some sort of applicability, but they're not sufficient. It's not sufficient that your judgment of the Catholic religion be in accordance with reason if you're simply judging it on interior experience um, or some sort of congruence between the teaching of the church and natural reason. And if you think, oh, that's just judgmental, that's mean of me. Well, this is what Vatican I anathematizes the opposite opinion. So I'm sorry that you don't like it, but that's just what's true. And I'm not here to tell you what you like. I'm here to tell you what's true. Okay. So what he says: external indications of his revelation, that is to say, divine acts. And first and foremost, miracles and prophecies, which clearly demonstrating, as they do, the omnipotence and infinite knowledge of God, are the most certain signs of revelation and are suited to the understanding of all. I just want to bring this to your attention right here. The most certain signs of revelation and are suited to the understanding of all. Now, this isn't to say, and this is something that Leo the 13th in Immortale Dei, I should probably bring it up. I think it's Immortale Dei. But he talks about how the darkening of the clouds of ignorance, the effects of sin, the effects of just our native stupidity, the fact that we're stupid, we're attached to sensible objects and material phantasms, and all of these, we're lazy. We don't actually do the research that we should. Because of all of this, it may be hard to perceive the truth of the Catholic religion from these signs and the miracles. But what it says is that actually, in itself, these are most certain signs that are suited to the understanding of all people. All people, okay? You've actually had some apologists, and sorry, this is actually why I'm recording a little bit early, because I'm starting to lose my voice. But you'll have certain apologists, and what they will say is they will try to downplay miracles. They'll downplay prophecies as true motives of credibility for the Catholic religion, or even as convincing and universally convincing ones. And this is just against the conciliar text. You can't hold to this. This is what is under anathema at Vatican I. It says, quote, if anyone says that divine revelation cannot be made credible by external signs, i.e., prophecies and miracles, and that therefore men and women ought to be moved to faith only by each one's internal experience or private inspiration, let him be anathema. So if you say that the external signs are not enough, you are anathema. You are a heretic. Okay? So we need to be very careful with playing with this fire of downplaying the external signs, as many contemporary apologists do when they do talk about this. So it continues, hence Moses and the prophets, and especially Christ our Lord himself, worked many absolutely clear miracles and delivered prophecies, while of the apostles we read, and they went forth and preached while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by the signs that attended it, end quote. So it goes on and says, well, the Moses and the prophets, Christ our Lord and the apostles, this is the way in which they did it. They preached the truth. They had certain signs, and whether they be miracles or whether it be referencing back to the prophecies, we see, for example, in the Gospels that the Pharisees, they ask for a miracle from Christ. And he says, well, that is, a wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign. Why? Because Moses and the prophets are already sufficient. The prophecies which told of Christ were already sufficient. That's why it's, a lot of people will bring that up against this idea, but when they're going in and they're preaching to different areas that are, not under the Mosaic covenant, you preaching to the Gentiles, they will often perform these. And this is exactly what is said at the end of the gospel, according to St. Mark, as I mentioned. It's actually the main point behind the ending of the gospel of St. Mark is to talk about the authentication of the apostles' message by miracles and signs. Anyways, and then this is just what's so beautiful, because as I mentioned earlier, I just love this part so much. And a lot of people, they miss this. This is part of the mystery of the church that a lot of people miss. But as I mentioned, under miracles, we have physical miracles, like raising somebody from the dead, turning water into wine. These are physical miracles, or whatever other miracles you can think about than people normally think about. You also have moral miracles. And moral miracles, this is basically, you can see that the effects of the gospel, this is something which is far up and beyond, and far exceeding what is possible by nature. Because a lot of people, I was actually talking to somebody who is a non-Catholic, and I was bringing this up actually as an argument. I'm like, look, I think the argument of the moral miracle of the spread of the gospel, this is more than sufficient evidence. It's bringing forward heroic acts of chastity, heroic acts of fortitude, heroic acts of all of these virtues in a way that is very consistent and universal. It's not like you have an example here and there, but you have a sort of, we have very certain and sure instruments that get used in the Catholic religion, sure teachings that get used in order to bring this about. It's not something occasional or per accident. This is per se. It's flowing from the very nature of the church, and therefore we can conclude, the hand of God is behind the church. Only God established the church, et cetera, right? So I was bringing this up to a non-Christian. They basically said, well, religious experience is very powerful. Religious motives of people having perhaps like a religious delusion that they think that they are being motivated by God, and therefore they will do a lot. They will chase their whole lives. They will, go to their death for this. But that really doesn't explain it. Per accidents, could explain a case here and there, but it really doesn't explain it. And I think we all kind of know. Any Catholic out there who has striven for a life of virtue, who has frequented the sacraments, frequented prayer, who believes, with no shadow of doubt that God has established the Catholic Church, they understand that they sin all the time, right? You guys understand this. You sin all the time. So it really doesn't make sense from an experiential point of view of people who are, in here and who are experiencing the means of grace and the spiritual teaching of the church. You understand your own weakness. And you understand that your sustenance only happens from a real, vital, and living relationship with God through Christ in the church. You understand this very, very well. So religious experience doesn't really explain the moral miracle of the church. It's really only can be explained through the hand of God with the church. This is what he says, continuing, to the Catholic Church alone belongs all those things so many and so marvelous, which have been divinely ordained to make for the manifest credibility of the Christian faith. What is more, the Church herself, by reason of her astounding propagation, her astonishing propagation, her outstanding holiness, and her inexhaustible fertility or fecundity in every kind of goodness, by her Catholic unity and her unconquerable stability, is a kind of great and perpetual motive of credibility and an incontrovertible evidence of her own divine mission. The Catholic Church itself, like the institution of the Catholic Church, all of her attributes and her effects show this forth in front of the eyes of all. So it comes about that, like a standard lifted up for the nations, she both invites to herself those who have not yet believed, and likewise assures her sons and daughters that the faith they profess rests on the firmest of foundations. And I actually want to, before I continue, I want to find that section from Immortali Dei, because I think this will be extremely, extremely helpful.
If you really enjoy this channel, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/militant Thomist. At the first level, you get access to the private Discord. At the second level, you get access to weekly bonus videos. At the third level, you get access to free translations, articles, and notes on the Summa of St. Thomas. On the fourth level, you get access to course videos and DM questions. And beyond this, there are many other benefits, so please make sure to check out patreon.com/militant Thomist.
Okay, I failed you. I couldn't find the quote that I'm looking for. But anyways, let's continue. So now with the next chapter, it goes over on faith and reason. So on faith and reason, it's talking about we have this ascent of faith. This ascent of faith is somehow, we have this reasonableness that comes from the judgment of credibility. It's brought about us within us by the power of the Spirit, the power of divine grace. So what's going on here with its relationship between that order of reason that we already mentioned, right? Does faith destroy reason? Does it, overcome it? Like, what's going on here? It says the perpetual agreement of the Catholic Church has maintained and maintains this too, that there is a twofold order of knowledge, distinct not only as regards its source, but also its object. So the sources of this twofold knowledge is, on the one hand, natural reason. That's the source of natural knowledge. On the other hand, divine faith. That's the origin of supernatural knowledge. With regard to the source, we know at the one level by natural reason, the other level by divine faith. With regard to the object, so source, that's like where the knowledge comes from. Object, that's what the knowledge tends to. With regard to the object, beside those things to which natural reason can attain, there are proposed for our belief mysteries hidden in God, which, unless they are divinely revealed, are incapable of being known. This is, Trinity, incarnation, all of those different mysteries that I brought up. Unless these were proposed for our belief by God, they are of the supernatural order. So since it's not only distinct by source, but as object, this is not anything we could know unless it was revealed by God and accepted by faith. Wherefore, when the apostle who witnesses that God was known to the Gentiles from created things comes to treat of the grace and truth which came by Jesus Christ, he declares, we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glorification. None of the rulers of this age understood this. God has revealed it to us through the Spirit. For the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. And the only begotten himself, in his confession to the Father, acknowledges that the Father has hidden these things from the wise and prudent and revealed it to the little ones. Which, once you start looking for this stuff throughout sacred scripture, you see it all the time. It's everywhere. But does that mean that reason is completely unattached to the life of faith? No. It says, now reason does indeed, when it seeks persistently, piously, and soberly, achieve by God's gift some understanding, and that most fruitful or most profitable of the mysteries, whether by analogy from what it knows naturally. So this is, by the way, right here, it's explaining and it's describing scholastic theology, which is funny. It's explaining scholastic theology. So what comes from fruitfully, what comes from reason here is scholasticism. It is seeking some knowledge or some understanding by analogy from what it knows naturally, or from the connection of these mysteries with one another and with the final end of humanity. But reason is never rendered capable of penetrating these mysteries in the way in which it penetrates those truths which form its proper object. So we can gather some understanding of them, but it's not going to penetrate deeply. It's not going to penetrate in the same way that it penetrates what it knows by nature. For the divine mysteries, so we're only going to see them in the beatific vision. For the divine mysteries, by their very nature, so far surpass the created understanding that even when a revelation has been given and accepted by faith, they remain covered by the veil of that same faith and wrapped, as it were, in a certain obscurity. As long as it is in this mortal life we are away from the Lord, for we walk by faith and not by sight. Even though faith is above reason, there can never be any real disagreement between faith and reason, since it is the same God who reveals the mysteries and infuses faith, and who has endowed the human mind with the light of reason. Okay, so that is all that I wanted to go over from Vatican I. I'm going to what I'm going to do? I'm sorry if anybody is annoyed by this, but I am actually going to find that quote from Leo the 13th. It's just such a good quote, and I think it's super helpful. So let me see. I quoted it in an essay. Okay, so it's in Immortali Dei number 6. because I think this goes perfectly with it for understanding the motives of credibility. Because it's trying to explain how a state, this is the question that's trying to explain. It's trying to explain how you can have a state who obviously, like the state as such, does not have the assent of divine faith. So, how can you have a state who has a union with the church and judges and legislates and rules in accordance with the Catholic religion when you have all of these mysteries above the understanding? You got to get what I'm saying? So it's trying to ask that question. What it says, well, there are these motives of credibility that can be judged by those even without faith. So, like on as a matter of principle, the state is competent to judge the motives of credibility and to say, no, actually, we're going to agree with what the Catholic Church says. You get it? That's kind of what the question is bringing up right now, because that was a very common liberal argument against, a liberal argument for the separation of church and state. Um, did I get the wrong chapter? Because it says, quote, certain and most clear marks show Catholicism to be the only true religion. Yeah, here we go. Since then, no one is allowed to be remiss in the service due to God. And since the chief duty of all men is to cling to religion, both in its teachings and practice, not such religion as they may have a preference for, but the religion which God enjoins, and which certain and most clear marks show to be the only one true religion, it is a public crime to act as though there were no God. Okay, so we have it here. But now he says in paragraph 7, now it cannot be difficult to find out which is the true religion, if it be sought with an earnest and unbiased mind, for proofs are abundant and striking. So what he says here is it cannot be difficult. So it is not difficult to judge the motives of credibility. These proofs are abundant, they're striking, they're frequent, they're common, but one has to seek with an earnest and unbiased mind. The effects of sin, the effects of ignorance, the effects of bias, and the effects of laziness, and all of these things, they actually entrap the mind from being able to see these abundant proofs, kind of like what Aristotle says. He says that we are before the most evident things, like an owl before the sun. The sun is the bright and clear thing. The owl can't really see it because, its eyes are messed up, at least according to Aristotle. I don't know whether owl eyes are actually like this. But in the same way, the man who is engrossed in sin and in ignorance and in all of those worst passions of mankind, while the Catholic Church stands before them as the sort of shining mark, this obvious thing, this striking and clear demonstration of the credibility of the Catholic religion, this person's going to reject it. It's very evident, but their eyes are shut to it, like the owl is, because the owl is used to night, and these people are used to darkness and ignorance and vice. So therefore, there's actually also upon this, we can draw another conclusion. We've already talked about presenting the motives of credibility, destroying the motives of discredibility. We've talked about the prayer, which is necessary because faith is something which is supernatural. We can also talk about removing all of that, the vice and the ignorance, and all trying as hard as you can, as much as nature allows, to remove all of those vices. And often what people will see is when they have the removal of vices, this is something that St. Peter Faber talks about. When you're evangelizing somebody and they have these vices removed, all of a sudden things snap into place for them and they will see more clearly the truth of the matter. So St. Jerome stated that it's rare to find a heretic who loves chastity. It is that kind of applicable to here. You kind of have to be asking what's going on. It's possible that you have somebody who's in good faith, but oftentimes you should, all the time you shouldn't assume that. You shouldn't just assume that everyone's in good faith, and that's why they don't see the abundant and striking proofs of the Catholic religion. He says, we have, for example, the fulfillment of prophecies, miracles in great numbers, the rapid spread of the faith in the midst of enemies, and the faith of overwhelming obstacles, the witness of the martyrs, and the like. From all these, it is evident that the only true religion is the one established by Jesus Christ himself, in which he committed to his church to protect and propagate. Okay. Well, I hope that was helpful. So that's all that I have for you. If you enjoyed this, if you appreciated this, then I would very much appreciate if you would go to patreon.com/militant Thomist. Um, running this, a lot of what I want to do is educational, right? I want to do streams like this where I spend, almost an hour and 20 minutes talking about divine revelation, Vatican I, the ascent of faith. But this isn't really what's interesting to a lot of people. A lot of people when they watch, they're like, "Oh, that was super helpful," but it's not doesn't get the most popular, it doesn't get the most clicks or anything like that. So what's very much appreciated is support. If you enjoy videos like this, support videos like this. So become a patron, give one of the super gifts or something like that, and help with kind of turning as much as I can into making videos like this, which I've said in the past, and I will say again. This is scholastic answers. This is not uh, church drama answers or I don't know, freaking whatever Redeem Zoomer is doing answers. I like to stick it to these topics. I like to try to stick it to the scholastic topics that are the sort of basis and foundation for my channel. And what's really helpful for that is to get support for that. So, anyways, I hope that you all appreciated this. Remember to like, subscribe, share, all of that. And as always, God bless.